Well, well, as Bill Buckley, well, no, no, I didn't mean to do that. You know how he reclines, looks at his
And I didn't mean to
pad
laugh.
there like that. I've always been fascinated by that, but I never could do it, although I did just then. Well, now, here we are. It's a great treat to have all of this fine panel, but particularly Vic Fazio, it is Fazio, not Fazio, who I worked with as part of the leadership while I was in the leadership of the Senate, and Vic was part of the leadership under Speaker Tom Foley, not Tim. Tim Healy was who I was thinking about.
Tim Foley played for
Tim
Miami
Foley.
Dolphins.
Oh, that's it. I remember him. And Tom Foley was a splendid speaker, and a part of his leadership panel was Vic Fazio, and we worked together on many things. So what we have here is a panel to talk about the elections, the 1998 congressional elections. And the panel here from my right, Mickey Edwards, currently a lecturer at the Kennedy School, who served 16 years in the Congress from Oklahoma's 5th District. He's a founding member of the Heritage Foundation and the American Conservative Union, and I served also in the Congress with Mickey and enjoyed that very much. Very thoughtful Republican from that area. Vic Fazio, as I say, retiring this year. I didn't tell you that. Retiring this year after 10 terms from the 3rd District of California. One of the Capitol's most effective legislators and a chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign 1990 to 1994, and in various leadership positions with the caucus of his party. And Susan Molinari, currently an IOP fellow, a 4-term member of Congress from the 13th District in New York, served as minority leader of the New York City Council. Husband Bill Paxson, also a member of Congress, and I served with her. It was a great pleasure to have done that. And Phil Sharp, a splendid help to me in this duty as director of the Institute of Politics, because Phil was formerly a director of the Institute of Politics and a currently lecturer at the Kennedy School and served 10 terms in the 2nd Congressional District in Indiana. I was chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee for 14 years. We were on many a conference committee together and never tangled on a bit of partisanship in that process. And so you have a remarkable resource here of these 4, and I'm going to ask them if they would just start right down the line and for 3 or 4 minutes tell you what they think about the coming next Tuesday, November 3rd, of the 1998 congressional elections. Mick?
I've got to go to the office and read Hotline or something to find out. I'm going to make no predictions whatsoever, but point to a couple of things that I think we ought to be watching for. There's probably not a very good chance that Republicans are going to gain the kind of a veto-proof Congress that at one point earlier this year they were talking about, although I think the odds are probably still pretty good. I'm sorry, Vic, that Republicans will gain some seats in the House and in the Senate. I think there are other issues here, though, that are very important to watch at a smaller level. There are not only governor's races, but there are many, many state legislative races. We're coming up on another census, and it's going to be very important for one party or the other to control enough state legislatures to dominate the next 10 years. So a lot of the races that are getting the attention, the race between Bozeman and Lincoln in Arkansas, which is a close race, between Boxer and Fong in California, between, well, there's a tough race, I think it's going to be a tough race in Kentucky between Scotty Baszler and Jim Bunning. There are some of these races that are getting a lot of public attention, but the more important thing is what these results are going to mean in terms of whether or not Republicans are going to get a message, as Vic has pointed out earlier, that they should proceed with the impeachment hearings, or getting a message, you ought to drop this, you ought to leave it alone. If you've noticed, the National Republican Congressional Committee is apparently not as confident as it once was, because they're launching a series of very hard-hitting TV spots that talk about the Lewinsky scandal. Probably is going to backfire on them, I would guess. But the key is to watch who wins, for example, in California. California, Vic State, is well over 10% of the entire Congress. And it looks now like there may be a Democratic governor elected in California. Those are the kinds of things that I think you ought to be watching for. Vic?
Well, this is the dreaded midterm election of the second 4 years of a Democratic presidency, and if you look to history in this midterm of the second term, you usually see losses that accrue to the party in power in the White House of anywhere from 25 to 40 members of Congress. That's the historic perspective. I think everybody realizes that we're not looking at that kind of cathartic change in direction of the country. Most Republicans would have been happy to pick up 20 seats in the House, and were probably initially optimistic about enough new Republican senators to make the filibuster inoperative. It looks now as if that's not going to occur in the Senate. Maybe Republicans are on the verge of a 1 or 2 pickup. That's because Democrats who were thought to be in trouble, like Fritz Hollings, are now doing better. Barbara Boxer, who was behind, is now ahead, and people like Governor Bayh are hanging on to their leads in what would normally be a Republican state. There clearly is an atmosphere of volatility here. It's a little early to call this election, but it looks like in the Senate we're battling to a standstill, and the Democrats 2 years from now will have no freshmen up. The Republicans have over 10. And there'll be a better opportunity to bring the Senate into some sort of parity. This was not the year in which Democrats could look to that. In the House, I think we're in a position where Republicans would be now happy to pick up 10 seats, not 20. And Democrats would hope that perhaps we could cut it even less than that. And there are even some optimists among us who think we might even pick up a couple. But that really relates to what factors are influencing turnout. We all know this is an election about turnout. Will our base turn out? Will their base turn out? Will they both turn out? Typically, Democrats don't vote in off-year elections, and Republicans always vote in every election. And as a result of the Clinton phenomena, whatever that is out there, we may see something different. We might see some energized Democrats who are going out to vote for the president through their vote for a senator or House member. And if that phenomena continues, we might see a better than normal turnout. We certainly begin to believe that will be true in African American communities. And then you may have a more volatile election than we ever would have envisioned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Susan.
Well, thank you. I did read the hotline, Mickey, and
good.
I
You're
thought
ahead of me.
this just goes to show you how professionally we can predict the results. I thought this was great. They asked political pundits for what they thought the GOP gains were going to be as a result, and you could see they were fairly consistent. Charlie Cook from National Journal said 5 seats in the House, 2 in the Senate. GOP pollster Ed Goa said 17 in the House, 5 in the Senate. UCA San Diego professor said 8 in the House, 3 in the Senate. Dem pollster Celinda Lake said 7 in the House, 1 in the Senate. Brookings Tom Mann said 6 in the House, 2 in the Senate. American University President Candace Nelson said, Professor, 2 House seats, 2 Senate seats. Roll call Stu Rothenberg said 7 in the House, 3 in the Senate. Maryland University Professor Ron Walters said 11 in the House, 3 in the Senate. Kind of a big discrepancy there, wouldn't you say? So that just goes to show you really what we're working with, and I think the other speakers are correct. There is a large amount of volatility out there. What we're looking at right now basically is, and we've all heard it, it was the year of the angry white male, the year of the soccer mom. They're trying to characterize this as the year of the waitress mom, but it is also undoubtedly, and the polls have not changed that much, the year of the incumbent. The incumbents have received a better rating this year than they have during the 1990s. That's going to assist the people who are running who are incumbents. The majority of the race then comes to the pickup of open seats. that, by and large, is going to be motivated by, and it is still where the volatility comes in, hard to predict what the turnout's going to be. This is an election that's going to be won, in many cases, in many races around the country, on who has the best get-out-the-vote campaign. I will only point to one other statistic that Chris Matthews on Hardball last night concentrated on, and I think it is probably the most indicative number that we've seen from polls thus far, and that is when asking the question, are you more or less enthusiastic about voting this year, Republicans by 44% said more enthusiastic, 33% less enthusiastic. The Democrats, when they asked, are you more or less enthusiastic about voting this year, 32% said more, compared to Republican 44% more. Where those factor in individual races could mean the difference in Republican pickups from whether it goes to 10 to probably the high point of 15 in the House of Representatives.
Thanks, Susan. Phil?
Well, I think we have an extremely unusual situation in this race. We have a situation in the country in which we have, only the third time in our history, an active impeachment proceeding underway. We have a major political scandal that's been running for months and months and months, and it is not the general subject of conversation in these political campaigns. By and large, and both sides have in most places felt it was too risky politically for them to advertise, for them to discuss it out in the open. And the implication and the suggestion is it's irrelevant to this election. Now, the polling is very sophisticated these days, very intense, and has been very accurate in many instances over the last several years on elections, but I personally am deeply suspicious that we do not know the outcomes of this. What Susan read off actually shows how narrow the range of point of view among the so-called experts is about the outcome of this election. I personally think there's an opportunity here. I may well be proved wrong. All the pundits going into it think this is the wrong point of view, that we don't know by a long shot what is going to happen, that citizens have an unusual habit of exercising free will. And that they will, despite our political campaigns, despite the news media, despite the pundits, they will up and say, you know, I've had enough. Or that I just think it's my duty. Or my neighbor got a hold of me and said, vote. I would feel much more comfortable about predicting if I were home in my old congressional district and if I were hearing from volunteers, well, what did they get feedback from? I can remember campaigns when they were doing calling in the last week to get people out to vote, and I could tell, now I made it through the election, but I could tell we were in trouble. Just the feedback coming back, the intensity of people's feelings. Now, this year I'm not voting. And we couldn't tell that in polls, and we didn't know what was happening. So I suggest what we have is an iceberg election here in which we're barely talking about the surface, and we don't know underneath whether it's going to have an impact. Maybe it won't, maybe it'll come out this way. Second point is the outcome of elections we're too focused on in this country on the numbers game of how many we win and how many we lose. Elections have far greater impact than just those. It certainly would make a difference in Washington if the Republicans gained a veto-proof Senate and 25, 30 seats in the House of Representatives. I don't think there's any question on policy that it would make a big difference, or if the House flip-flopped to Democrats. So I'm not understating that. But what I would suggest to you is that even if we get the sort of status quo numbers that people are talking about and predicting at the moment, we may see incumbents change their minds about a number of things. The most important question being, are you going to impeach the President of the United States? Because I would suggest to you that what's happening back home now, and you can participate in as citizens, is what message is going to the people that are going to be your representative, even if they've got the election down cold. People are hearing back. On the Republican side, or let me put it this way, pro-impeachment people, they're not all Republicans, pro-impeachment people the question will be whether they're being reinforced back home by friends and neighbors. Do it. You got to do it. It's what's important to the country. Or are they hearing, okay, we've had enough, from their friends and their core supporters, and likewise on the other side. One other quick comment, and that is the impact of this on incumbents too, is how we interpret this election after it's over. And there will be a focus on election night on 2 or 3 things around the country. On impeachment, let me suggest one, the race of Jay Inslee against Rick White in the state of Washington. anti-impeachment forces, pro-Clinton forces, assuming that we see the upset there that some people are predicting. I don't know that it'll happen, that Jay Inslee wins. He's a former member of Congress, Democrat, who's taking on one of the 1994 victors, Rick White. Assuming he wins, Clinton supporters will say, aha, it shows you, because this is one of the few places in the country as of tonight where the advertising is on the issue of impeachment, and the Democrat is challenging the impeachment vote of the Republican. So what you will get is interpretation of if he wins, that, well, we told you so. When this really gets out above, when it's above the water as an issue, people will vote on it. Now, the counter side will argue, because it will still be unclear, that, well, that may have been an issue, but there were really lots of other issues that determined this outcome. But a few races like that will be picked up, and I can assure you incumbents will talk about them among themselves, if not out in public.
Thank you, Phil. And now, Vic, as our guest, I get to ask you the first question. Now, all of us have been there. I mean, Oklahoma, New York, Indiana, Wyoming, and you're there. You have just come through. I think all of us would love to know the inside story, which is so real that all of us know what really happened in the last few weeks as we go into this election that has shifted and changed, leaving out even the president's aspects as to where it was legislatively.
Is it really that hard to be gone?
It is.
We're all in denial.
We all
or
kind
something?
of like it.
I guess I worry about that since it's about to be my fate. But I would say this. We felt as Democrats that we had suffered mightily, not just because of the preoccupation with Monica Lewinsky and the president's problems in terms of the media obsession, but the fact that it kept the Capitol Press Corps from covering managed care reform, quality of care issues in health care. It kept them from covering the debate over how to aid the schools. It kept them, frankly, from disclosing that campaign finance reform had been given the knife in the dead of the night and that tobacco hadn't even been brought up on the House floor. I mean, it was a very, very frustrating year for us, really almost a year back to January. And so I would say in the last week, we really, for the first time, emerged on top on an issue. And in the budget fiasco that was really brought about by an inability of the Republicans in the House to bring their appropriations bills to completion, the president took advantage, using the bully pulpit, of the issue of reforming the public schools. And for the first time, we got a message out about more teachers and more classrooms. And if anything made us feel good on leaving town, and leaving town usually makes us feel good just in and of itself, it was that. And I think that probably gave heart to and an issue and a message to a lot of Democrats who've been, frustrated by our inability to get out on the table the things we were doing well on in every poll, where people were on our side, but were really kind of unable to focus on, given all the media focus and attention on scandal. It's also fair to say that the vote on impeachment was seen as an important vote, perhaps more so by us then than the public now, but there is still a perception that Republicans did not treat the president fairly in the process. Now, obviously, the Republican base vehemently disagrees with that, and they, we anticipate, will be out there voting. But whether or not it will engender Democrats to go out and vote who otherwise would not have, the statistics you heard earlier about their level of interest withstanding, maybe something comes out of that. I tend to think less will come than I would hope, but I do think it is a factor. The third issue, though, is something that goes on all during the Congress, and that's fundraising. Republicans have a tremendous financial advantage, probably a 2-to-1 advantage over Democrats. We used the term carpet bombing during the last 2 weeks. There will be an incredible Republican dominance on television and radio in the last 2 weeks. And that may, more than anything else, limit the optimism of Democrats, who may even be ahead in some races, but who will not have the resources to be competitive down the stretch.
Susan, you have a study group and a lot of fine young people. Your study group is Mr. and Mrs. Smith, now runs Washington. And what is your thought as you have served in Congress, and you hear some of these young people in the study groups, and what do you think are the social issues hot ones as we go into the election? Are they the substance issues? Where are we with just as you hear it from them, even though you're working in a broad range?
Well, I think that in what has been reflected not only in my study group but in conversations that we've had pretty much around the country and going back to my own district, I think Dick is right that there has been sort of a lack of message out there for a number of reasons this year in Washington. So even though this is an election year, we've not focused on the partisan differences between how best to run a healthcare system. Should we cut taxes? I mean, this was a debate that was boiled down into about 2 weeks during a budget appropriations blow-up, and but for that, we really didn't have that much discussion. I think that it is also true that up until recent weeks, people were very comfortable, majority of people were very comfortable with the economy, with jobs, with production. They started to see Washington as more and more irrelevant in their lives, and some would argue that that could be a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. And that complications in the world arena notwithstanding, that we were pretty much safe and secure. So that the issues really just boiled down to the status quo for this November, to keep things going as people were able to enjoy their lifestyles, as it were. Still, the outstanding issues, I do believe, come down, particularly for the Republican Party in terms of tax cuts on education. I think the Republicans have an education platform, although they don't enunciate it or speak about it too loudly or very well. But the majority of the feelings reflected in a poll that says 68% of people polled say that their incumbent should be reelected, I think sort of lends even more blasé attitude to what is normally anticipated in a midterm election. This is not all that surprising. This is not all that catastrophic. Midterm elections sometimes bring, if things are pretty good, people feeling somewhat unfocused on Washington, D.C. and the way that vote can have a seismic shift in their lives.
Alan,
Yes.
there was an interesting polling statistic this week, it seemed to me, it struck me, was the question was, does it make any difference to you whether Republicans or Democrats run the House of Representatives? And 24% said, yes, it should be Republican. 22% said, no, it should be Democrats. 48% said it makes no difference. These were likely voters. Now, I think you would probably not find that statistic in past history, but I haven't followed that kind of number, and I'm not sure that was the kind of thing asked. But it struck me that this gets at sort of this sense of irrelevancy that a number of people seem to feel about not making a difference.
This is not an election that's going to be, maybe it's not irrelevancy, but this is not an election year that's going to be nationalized. Anti-Clinton, anti-GOP, pro-healthcare. Sometimes out there are these issues that rally everyone around one way or the other. This year, that's not the feeling out there. These, I think, by and large, are going to be elections that are going to be decided on the basis of the personalities of the two candidates, certainly on the money, but it is more local races around the country rather than one party versus another on a national tide.
Let me ask you, Mick, you were the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, and you worked hard on the Conservative Union group. I was talking to Trent Lott about 10 days ago, and he told me that 4 of the House members, unnamed, had come into his office and said, here's our chance. The president is wounded, and now's our chance to close the government again, and this time we'll win. And it is not recorded, the exact extent of his response. But you know the party, and I know the party, and you have some, and the package was put together, as Vic says, earlier in the evening by 4 or 5 people. The administration, 4 or 5 people. Where does all that lead for the Republicans on a congressional?
Well, I mean, it's always been fairly accurately said that if Republicans ever formed a firing squad, it would be in a circle. We've gotten really good at blowing it. And, I think that one of the things that you have to look at in terms of the results, not just the numbers and the message it sends about the president, but and Vic will know more if this is true in his party, but I sense that in both parties, and I know that in the Republican Party, the real struggle is going on within the caucus, in our case, within the House and Senate Republican conferences, between those people who are really fierce hardliners, who are quite willing to shut down the government, and those who are more moderate. Most of the members of the Republican conference are conservative, and when I say more moderate, I mean more moderate in temperament, more willing to try to reach an agreement, trying to move in the direction they want to move, but to keep the government functioning at the same time. And then you have the scorched earth type, and there are quite a few of them. And what I'm going to be watching for is the particular, I'm going to see whether Bob Dornan recaptures, his House seat from Loretta Sanchez in California. I think what we're looking at is the Republicans, at least, maybe the Democrats as well, are going to interpret the numbers they have and who's elected after this election to decide whether or not it's going to be all-out war for the next 2 years. What Newt Gingrich called, Newt, who's now the spokesman for the moderates in the Republican Party, what he called the perfectionist caucus, and whether they dominate or whether, in fact, more reasonable heads prevail in the next 2 years.
Well, there's no question that what happened, which advantaged the president, was that Republicans didn't fight through their own internal differences, largely on social issues, not on spending, that really served up to the White House this opportunity to tee off on the House Republicans in the budget process at the very end game. We went way past the 1st of October without even having sent bills to the president, because the Republican leadership, somewhat divided already over the question of succession to Gingrich, has been unwilling to put the pragmatic group in charge of the, hardliners who were unwilling to compromise. And as a result, they became vulnerable to a Democratic president who had every reason to show that division and, frankly, to take advantage of them, as he did so effectively. It was their own internal division, and frankly, as a Democrat, we don't have much else to count on but the Republicans to set us up to get our message out. They missed their opportunity and, frankly, paid a price for it, larger than any of them had anticipated. And there's a great deal of backbiting now going on within the Republican conference, and may even be some suppression of Republican-based support, because the pork barreling that went on in that room exceeded what any Republican ever thought they could be associated with. It caused people like Bob Byrd to be a critic. And I think most of you know that Senator Byrd has reveled in his role as chairman of the Appropriations Committee for many years. I mean, that's going quite a long way.
Is that because he didn't get his pork in the bill,
No.
though?
No, he got his.
I just wanted to know.
Ted Stevens takes care of Bob Byrd.
The CIA was going to be in West Virginia.
As Mark Hatfield used to say, who was the ranking member, and Senator Byrd was the chairman, he said, "I just sit around and wait for the crumbs."
Yeah.
And the crumbs filled everything in Oregon.
Right.
Yeah, so it works. It worked.
He did very well.
In terms of the ultimate impact of this end of the session appropriations process, it seems to me that from the average citizen's point of view, probably most didn't get the message, and it will not have a dramatic impact on the general thinking of the populace. But it did have two significant impacts, I think. One is on the Democratic side. It re-energized these folks. I've never in 20 years of watching us shoot ourselves on the Democratic side seen such an incredible display of unity, enthusiasm, and ready to go home. And Vic could speak to this more than I could, but my suspicion was the trepidation up until that week of the Democrats in this election was very intense. And it really helped to energize and motivate those folks. The second impact is more significant politically, and that is simply that one of the fundamental arguments that has been made about President Clinton since he got into his hot water is that, well, he can't govern now. He has no trust. Right. And a couple things have happened that have really diminished that argument. One can argue over how well he can govern or how much he can govern or what strength he'll have, but it's no longer a black and white question. He clearly came out winning, causing things to happen, everything from $18 billion for the IMF to other kinds of things that might be less attractive from a public policy point of view. The secondly thing is, of course, with the Middle East thing, so suddenly that evaporates as he's so wounded himself he can't lead on anything, because he just did. You can argue from your partisan point of view whether that was just luck on his part or not. But what I think some Republican leaders probably miscalculated at the end of this session was the assumption that this time he's really flat on his back, and we can do what we need to do. And the problem was, of course, the internal caucus problem for them.
Well, that's very true. Let me add, there's another one, and you don't see it, but it's there, as a Republican who happens to be pro-choice, just as my good colleague, or two. And that's the issue of abortion, because that's what held up, and is still holding up, the funding of the United Nations. One man, Chris Smith of New Jersey, has decided that this is his obsession, and it is very difficult for me to watch that. Not because of the issue itself; it's the rigidity and the total take no prisoners, and that's what held up the IMF. It's what was holding up Mike Sullivan, the governor of Wyoming, who's now going to be the ambassador to Ireland. The Wyoming people are very thrilled and honored by that. Democrat governor who was just appointed. They were holding it partly because of that.
There are 3 or 4 appropriations bills
appropriations
that were held
bills.
up just on that issue in one form or another.
And when I was assistant leader, I said, look, let's vote on that once a year, or twice a year if you want, but not 6, 7, 8 times, or just hanging on everything. And unless we resolve that,
I think we voted on it 90 times in this Congress.
okay, there you are. And we will never elect a Republican president. I don't care who we put up, unless that issue is resolved, and you do it with one sentence that just says abortion is a deeply intimate and personal decision, and out of respect for each other, it will not be part of the platform. If we can't do that, doesn't matter. We could sit and sing all night. I campaigned all over this country for George Bush and Bob Dole, and thousands of young women between 18 and 35 just dumped them like a hot rock, and they'll do it again and again and again. So that issue, there it is, down underneath. I don't know, do any of you think it will affect, of course these races are so local you can't tell. I don't think it'll affect Senate and House races. Do you, Phil? But I think it will affect the presidency in 2000.
There's an interesting thing happening, I understand, in the Feingold race, Senator Feingold, and it is that he seems to be having some trouble on the abortion issue. Now, it's because his opponent was able so far to focus the issue on the partial birth position, and while the issue is focused on that, he was running into serious problems, and polling was showing it was actually shifting voters on his score. Now, I understand that he's focused his message now on broader issues of pro-choice, and that may be flipping back. If that election turns out that Feingold loses, I would think that the anti-abortion forces, the pro-life forces, would use that as an interpretation that they're right. In the end, they should go forward. It actually is not, as Senator Simpson says. I tend to agree with Senator Simpson, but it's not like he says. They would say that we can both be right on our issues and we can win. But we'll see. That's that kind of interpretation that happens.
Well, you know, this issue...
Susan, yeah,
Go ahead,
Vic, you go ahead, and then Susan.
I would say, first of all, Republicans are becoming more adept at dodging this issue. I'm watching Sauerbrey, as Gilmore did in Virginia last year, quickly dismiss that she wants to make any changes in existing law, and then move on to parental choice, or the so-called partial birth abortion, or taking someone over state lines, or whatever. Change the subject from the basic issue. So Republicans are learning how to take this punch, roll with it, and move on. But it's still a cutting-edge issue, certainly in the Fong boxer race in California. I think it tends to be on the coasts for pro-choice people and elsewhere for anti-choice people. But it is still, for Republicans more than Democrats, the energizing issue that gets people involved in party politics. And it's impossible for the party, the Republican Party, not as much for the Democrats, to walk away from your base on this issue, because it is what motivates people. In a low turnout, it's important, and when you're looking for volunteers, it's essential.
Susan?
I was just going to add, particularly in the Northeast, I mean, I don't think it has been much of an issue, and I think that
It's a subtle issue.
the intensity of it has died down. It is a subtle issue, but it is also subtle when a doctor in Amherst, New York, gets killed 2 weeks before an election for performing abortions as well as you know, numerous births, assisting in numerous births. When that happens, I think you might not see that in a poll, but I think from an emotional standpoint, it leaves pro-choice women in particular, although I'm not sure the same isn't for pro-choice men, sort of rethinking the issue, all other things being equal. And I would suggest that that voter's mind at this point in time would have to have all other things being equal for something as subtle as
Well,
that.
in this
Because
case-
clearly, you know, I'm not suggesting that anyone who is pro-life would suggest that that was appropriate, but it will have a subtle impact, I think, on some races.
Chuck
that are very
Schumer is
close.
running an ad pointing out that Al D'Amato had not voted on a bill that would have propounded protection for clinics, and whether or not that's going to affect the turnout. And the vote in New York, we'll know soon, but it looks like he at least thinks he has an advantage on D'Amato on that one.
Al, let me
Yes,
add something.
Mick.
I think the problem is even broader than that. I think, for one thing, Chris Smith, as you said, is on a crusade that I think most of the Republicans in the House wish he would, you know, just stop. I don't know whether you were serious about 90 votes. You know, I'm sure there were, you know, 80 or 90 votes. It was an issue that was always on the table. And it's kind of an awkward position for Republicans. And one, it kind of goes against the basic conservative philosophy, which was the government ought to stay out of your life. And yet, you know, here's an area in which some of these people are quite involved in getting the government into people's lives. So philosophically, it's awkward, but the problem is for Republicans that it is the people who are the most ardently against abortion who are the ones who address the envelopes, who come out and work in the campaigns, and so it becomes a very difficult position. But I think even beyond that disparity between what conservative philosophy ought to be and where Republicans find themselves with their base, is that it spills over into a lot of other issues where women in particular, young women, but not only young women, women in particular, have felt that the Republican Party was in fact moving away from them in a way that many of them just would never consider voting Republican. And that's something the party is going to have to resolve, because I think if the Chris Smiths continue to dominate the Republican base, which is a big base, but the Republican base is going to get narrower and narrower. And I've been saying for years, there is no way the Republican Party is going to remain a dominant party, you know, if in huge majorities the women of the country just won't vote for them.
Okay, let's pick on Democrats for a while, can we?
Well, actually,
Okay,
let me
your
say,
turn.
if I could just say,
Well, we're going to take questions here in just one second.
Oh,
Phil?
these people won't pick on Democrats.
we've been talking about this issue.
Well, don't count on it.
We've been talking about
You
this
know
issue.
where you are. Just kidding.
We've been talking about this issue in very pragmatic
kidding.
terms. We've been talking about this issue in very pragmatic political terms about what abortion means. But I think what we've got to fairly understand here is this is akin to the anti-Vietnam War issue. And that is, if you fervently believe you are right, 90 votes is no problem. 600 is no problem. 14,000 is no problem. If you truly believe this is murder, then you are going to lick more stamps, you are going to take more action, you are going to insist. This is not a game, this is not a play game. And the same with the anti-Vietnam folks. There were varying opinions in that, just as there are on abortion, but people who were fervent on it, there was no excuse. There were no too few votes. There was no nothing. Now, this is just a classic political problem, which it's easy when you don't agree with the other side to see how wrong they are, or silly they are, or how disorganized they are, or how defeated they are with other goals you have. But if you truly believe this in one way or the other on one of these issues, you don't give up, and you don't stop, and you don't tolerate our joking about this. This is for real. And that's something that we have to understand in politics is intensity goes way beyond
Sure.
numbers. Majority rule is not the issue.
Right.
It is, what do you believe? How passionate you are? Will you invest yourself in what you believe? And people who do on whatever issue get way ahead in our system of
It's
government.
the same with the Second Amendment issue, the NRA.
Yeah.
It's not how many postcards you get. You know exactly how they're going to vote, and they will vote. And members are intimidated when they come up against an interest group that feels as deeply as they clearly do about their issue. It crosses over to philosophy, religion, and culture.
Yeah, and
It
you
is
have-
not a political
Belief
And
is
you have-
power in this system.
And you had part of your district, which is like Wyoming, where gun control is how steady you hold your rifle. You have that. You have that. You have that. You have that.
Yeah, I just had a highway named for me, and I suggested within 2 weeks the NRA would be by to blow it right off the post. You know, because they may want to make the final statement on whether my name will stand in the district.
Well, let's have some questions now from the audience. Step right up and just give your name and fire away, if you would, please, and direct it, if you wish, to a certain one or maybe all. We'll get into about 20 or 30 minutes of that.
Hi, my name is Joseph Liu. I'm a KSG mid-career alum, and I had a question about campaign finances, actually. We seem to see an improvement in independent expenditure strategy in every election cycle, and it seems to be hitting pretty hard in the last weeks as well this time. Effectively, are there any bars to nonprofit and corporate contributions for the next election cycle? Are there any rules whatsoever in campaign finance anymore? And what's this going to mean to the type of candidates and campaigns we're going to see in 2 years from now?
Well, let me start. I mean, there are many, many rules. You know, corporate contributions are not permitted. There's a $1,000 limit on what anybody, even Bill Gates, can give. You know, there are big holes in terms of soft money, which is not adequately regulated. But in terms of other kinds of limits, there are a great many, and they probably need to be enforced better than they have been. But you know, I personally kind of like the idea of individuals getting in and supporting candidates they believe in with their volunteer work and their money. I mean, I think that's a pretty good system.
Ironically, one set of limits may be pushing the money off the charts more. It's like squeezing a balloon. It comes out somewhere else. So we have limits on the $1,000 expenditure, the $5,000 for PAC, which we used to debate that was way too much. Now those look like a pittance compared to what slips in behind the door. We've got to bring this under limitations, it seems to me, and we've got to raise the limits on what an individual can do that's more realistic. I didn't think I'd ever argue for that side of things, but the reality is that the highly restricted area probably works pretty well. But all it's done is cause the water to flow to the cracks, as people say, cracks in the wall.
Sue, do you have any thoughts? Vic?
I would just say I think that basically the old federal law that we passed in the 70s has been totally eviscerated by soft money, as Phil says, coming in from every different direction. Today, district after district, you may have more money spent by forces that don't represent directly either of the candidates.
Right.
Third-party money coming in from interest groups or groups called Citizens for Reform that don't even have to report where their money comes from. So the guy that can give 1,000 or maybe 2, if he gives in the primary in general, or with his wife, or maybe 4, is being superseded by the multimillionaire who gives 600,000 to Citizens for Reform, who'll run ads in so-and-so's district because he knows that's a targeted Democratic seat, or vice versa. But frankly, at the moment, the advantage is largely on the side of the Republican Party. Lots has been made of labor's involvement in the last election, but labor is outspent by business in this country 11-1. If we can't close down the soft money, particularly from third-party groups, not just the two parties spending beyond the limits, which they're now, by court decision, allowed to do, we are really in total disarray in terms of any limitation on what people can spend. I frankly don't see us changing that law under this Congress or the next one. And I think more people are going to be upset about it as time goes on.
But don't you think, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not familiar with the numbers, but didn't the Democrats, people who were allied with Democrat candidates, outspend in '96 than they
Well, I think when you total up what the two parties spend,
No, I mean, soft money coming in from the outside. I mean, it seems to me we took
In
a
the
bruise in
presidential-
96.
I don't think we really
Presidential.
know how to typify a lot of the third-party money because it doesn't come in under party heading. But it is, by and large, been influenced by the right, not the left. Other than labor, we don't have much of a source for that kind
Well,
of spending.
labor's a substantial source, though. I don't
Well,
think you can dismiss
it's
that if you're a
certainly
Republican running
substantial.
against it.
But as I said a minute ago, it's outnumbered greatly by what the business community puts up versus labor.
In
La-
soft money advertising?
In soft money as well, I'm talking about all kinds of hard and soft money.
Okay.
Labor puts up both as well.
This young man?
Thanks. My name's Adam Sofa, and I'm a sophomore at the college. And my question's for the whole panel. This summer, I think we've seen more anti-gay rhetoric coming out of the Congress than we've seen in a long time. I mean, there's been the Heffley Amendment, which would overturn, the ban on discrimination, the Riggs Amendment to punish the city of San Francisco, the kleptomaniacs comment from Trent Lott. So I want to know how you guys think, this rhetoric is going to influence the election. Is that going to energize the Republican base, or is it going to get gay voters to vote for Democrats?
Start right there, Mick.
I don't know how it's going to influence the election. I don't know if it's going to influence it at all. But I think it's disgusting that either party is doing it.
I don't think there are any people on the conservative right who weren't going to vote anyway, who were going to be motivated to vote because of some gay bashing. There may be some backlash among gays and lesbians who may be rather apolitical and decide it's time to become more politically involved. But that would be, I think, about it. Actually, I'm very impressed to the degree that members have stood up and fought back on these issues and in some cases defeated those amendments.
I would only add again, I think that I would hope that that would be interpreted wisely as not the overall national sentiment of a political party, and that people in the gay and lesbian community would look at who the various candidates are and what their positions have been and what their votes have been. And you take an example like a D'Amato-Schumer race where D'Amato gets the Human Rights Campaign Fund endorsement, and that that will eventually hopefully bring about a balance and make us all a lot more responsible in the rhetoric that we employ as national leaders.
Well, it's interesting, in the California race, you may know Matt Fung, the Republican running against Barbara Boxer. He has actually, last week was it, I think, or the week before, signed a pledge on those issues to the gay community. Ironic, sort of as one might expect, he's got backlash to that as well, and he's got himself caught between two political forces at the moment, which actually, not just because of this issue, but other issues, may be the chance for Barbara Boxer to come through. She obviously has strong support from the gay community in California.
Well, let me say, the painful thing of these last weeks is being from Wyoming. That's my native state. And Matthew Shepard was in Cody, Wyoming last summer and met people, and they enjoyed him. And then to have that occur, and I participated at the candlelight vigil at the Capitol, and to tell people that that's not who we are. And it was good that the services were held in Wyoming, and to think that there were people near the service with signs that said, "God hates fags," is really sick. I mean, sick, sick. And that's the kind of thing that's out there in the electorate on every issue. And while the people in the middle of the scenery are just shaking their heads at nuts on the right and nuts on the left. And that's something, but the young man's death could be a new awareness, a martyrdom type of thing, of an awareness of insensitivity, and so sad, but that could be a name that will not be forgotten as to something that was hideous.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Sad.
this, yes. Oh, up here, I'm sorry, yes.
Hi,
The upper balcony.
my name is Mariah Starr. I'm a senior at the college. I want to refer to a statement that Philip Sharp made before the questioning session began about beliefs in politics. On three issues, abortion, gay rights, and affirmative action, they tend to bring up a lot of emotions and a lot of passions on both sides. Now, you can posit that belief drives politics. You can also posit that politics is the art of the practical. How do you reconcile the practical and the ideal? I mean, can you really have both ways in which only politicians are concerned about, legislation and laws and ignoring stuff that actually drives the people? It seems like that's left for academia, philosophy, religion. You don't even really address it much in a political sphere.
Well, since I raised the subject, first of all, it goes on all the time, inside the House of Representatives, outside the House of Representatives, that people address belief and ideals and visions, and it even happens in closed-door backroom meetings where people actually speak up and say, I don't believe in that, or I believe in this or that. You just don't hear about that. Now, it's true that there's an enormous amount of calculation about how do we create a majority, how do we get this done, how do we get anywhere. But it seems to me the good and effective politicians are able to say, here's my goals, here's my beliefs, and then work out pragmatically how do we get there. The difference that we're talking about that the Republicans are struggling with, Democrats have struggled with this too, it's always a problem for everybody, is precisely that question of those people who come and think they can individually pursue only their view, and that ultimately public policy has to be made with a more collective agreement. And interestingly enough, it's a tension. There's no magic way out of it at all. But if it were all just pragmatic, well, let's just see what the polls say. First of all, I think you'd have fewer people that would put their energy and effort into this to begin with. You know, for people to put up with the hard work and the stuff that they have to do, the goodies of public office are not so great as the American people seem to think they are. And the fact is that if they don't have some sense of self-respect, some sense of goals, some sense of values, most of them don't stay around very long. Now, all of us left, but we, by and large, are pretty long-term folks.
Yeah, you've got 72 years of service here. That's pretty good.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jeff Battalion. I'm a sophomore at the college. In 1996, President Clinton's coattails had a devastating effect in my state, and I'm wondering, with all the success now of all the governors running for re-election, the Republican class of '94, if there'll be a similar coattail effect on the other side this election?
I would say coattails are shorter these days, all the time. Right. I keep hoping Gray Davis is ready to play the grand piano and has them touching the floor. But I think, in fact, most governors have coattails, but not long ones, and the president maybe affected 10 or 15 races fundamentally in terms of the outcome. But I think that's more of the politics of slate voting, and that's a thing of the past, even in Chicago these days.
Yeah, it's not coattails in the sense that I'm going to vote for Vic because he's on the same ticket as Al and I'm for Al. You know, that really doesn't work very much. But what does work is if you have somebody on the ticket, at the head of the ticket, who's in a tight race, that people are really motivated to get out and vote. So for example, in the Harshbarger-Cellucci race here in Massachusetts, if organized labor and the natural supporters of Scott Harshbarger really get fired up. Now, after the last debate, probably nobody has any supporters, anymore. But if they got fired up, and the Democrats really went out to the polls to elect Scott or to get Cellucci out of the corner office, it could help Tierney in his congressional race. It can help other races as well. So that's probably as close as you're going to come now to real coattails.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add is that, there is some kind of synergy that works sometimes not only from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I think specifically of New York. I don't think anybody's going to really know how the New York Senate race between D'Amato and Schumer is going to turn out because we can't really judge the effect yet of Governor Pataki having a 33-point lead. Does that diminish participation, or does that allow him to spend a substantial amount of his remaining dollars on getting out the vote for him, assuming that majority of those would go for Senator D'Amato? And also, likewise, for members of Congress up sometimes, and local races that get people sometimes more energized, and then do they stay on the ballot? So it's not that they go down, not necessarily aware, but is there one person out there that can pull them out to vote, and while they're there, they'll vote for that individual?
I might add, this is added to the disarray once people are elected, too, the degree to which you can't hold a party line in a caucus.
Right.
Because people don't have as much loyalty to their ticket, they didn't get there that way.
I'd just like to reinforce what Susan said, because we here at the Kennedy School, we talk about presidents and senators and governors, and as if this is a whole ballgame. A good sheriff's race in a county will be what generates the enthusiasm, the interest, sometimes that overpowers or causes one side to really get out their supporters or not. Local politics matters. People know these people, and they sometimes have a tough issue. So you want to be a little careful about we fly so high and forget that there's the rest of a real world out there.
That's a very truth. Yes, Eric.
Eric Shapsis, I'm a second year at the Kennedy School, and I'm going to take advantage of having a distinguished member of Congress from the great state of California and ask Congressman Fazio about the races in California, particularly the two open seats, yours and Congresswoman Harman's, and it said that with the two of you leaving, those seats will not be Democrat seats anymore. The rest of the incumbents who have more difficult seats, it looks like they'll sail through. I would assume the rig seats goes back Democrat. Will the Democrats ever get back your seat and Jane Harman's seat? And what's the long term?
Well, we're at the end of a decade. We have one more election after this one before we change the lines again. And of course, in California, where we may pick up anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 additional seats, and where the population shifts around pretty dramatically, these districts could look very different. I think there'll be very close races in both Jane Harman's seat and mine. These are both very marginal seats for both parties. I was frankly more pessimistic until I went home, and just must tell you that the Democratic base is coming up in California. I think both those races are in play. Thompson will win the Riggs seat, and there are 3 or 4 incumbents, 2 or 3 Democrats and a Republican or 2 who might have a race as well. But I think you're generally right, and this is an incumbent election.
Yes, sir.
My name is Don Moore. I'm a third-year doctoral student at the business school. An issue that concerns me mightily is growing inequality of incomes in this country. And history says that strong labor unions are probably the most important single factor in compelling organizations, business organizations, to share some of the wealth that they generate so effectively with their employees. Can you say something about the influence of labor and where you think that's going in the future?
Well, I mean, organized labor for a number of years has diminished in its political clout, and partly because fewer employees have joined labor unions. They've had a hard time there. I think politically, however, there's been a commitment by the people in the unions that are there to get much more politically active. I think that in the race here between Romney and Kennedy for the Senate, that it was organized labor that saved that seat for the Democrats and defeated the Republicans. I mean, I really do see in some of the unions anyway a new exercise of political clout, and I think that Republicans, at least in strategizing, do not discount the effect of the get out the vote effort by organized labor, which is if money is the secret weapon that Vic says that Republicans have, the support, the volunteer work on election day by labor is probably the secret weapon that the Democrats have still.
Well, I might just say I think labor is doing 2 things now since John Sweeney took over. And one is emphasizing organizing, which labor had basically stopped doing. And 2, re-energizing their political activities and not just giving money to candidates, but generating labor votes, labor participation, and attempting through issue ads to influence public opinion in general, which they did more last time. This time they're focusing more internally. The 226, the proposition in California, which was really designed to limit labor's ability to participate in politics, energized the base of the labor movement, and they voted in much larger proportion to the general electorate than they had in many years. Sometimes it takes an attack on what they had assumed to be their right to be able to find new motivation. And I think you're seeing a new and more highly motivated labor movement.
If I could just add something. I think, first of all, and I could be dead wrong about this, but since I was in Congress, you learn to talk about anything. But the history of labor's power and influence on this income distribution, I think, is less of their past political success and more their impact within the business organizations, so that the wealth had to be shared, which you alluded to, and that was the real impact historically of labor. It had political influence as well and changed public policy, but it really had its major impact in our society by causing a better distribution of wealth in that regard. I mean, I see that as a plus. Some people may not. I think the tougher issue is, and although I think Vic alluded to it, they are trying now to organize other areas. But my sense is the economy, the problem is dividing between real wealth-producing businesses and non-wealth producing businesses, or at least very limited wealth producing. So even if you get organized, what is there to divide up? And that by and large, I suspect wages, because of the competition for skill, are reasonably paid. In other words, that's why unions have trouble organizing many of these new businesses, because why should I join the union? I get a pretty good salary, I get pretty good benefits, and they know they have to pay attention to me. So it's a different world. So I think we have a different problem of having to figure out how we deal with income inequality rather than using the historical example, is my sense.
Well, I think you also have to take into account that the global marketplace is more of a player in all these discussions and all these debates and all these analysis as to how we distribute income, and do we cross country boundaries in that too, and that will complicate the debate.
But you wouldn't have minimum wage or family and medical leave or earned income tax credits if you didn't have people organized through the labor pushing for those issues.
And these help. I mean, these make a difference, but I don't think they were the fundamentals, is my sense. But
Yes, this gentleman. Hello.
Yeah, Charles Borden. I'm a
Like
first
the
year.
albatross and the Brian of the Ancient Mariner there, up on the mast. Go ahead.
No, I'm Charles Borden. I'm a first-year student at the law school. Actually, you mentioned in your opening remarks about the caucus races, which will follow this election, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about those races, particularly with reference to the outcomes of the election. I mean, one of the things you've heard a lot about this year is how both parties have targeted seats better and selected candidates who fit those seats better. You know, for example, Bob Greenlee for the Republicans in the Colorado 2nd, or Ken Lucas for the Democrats in the Kentucky 4th. That means in both cases, depending on how this election turns out, one party's more or lesser wing of the party may be strengthened vis-a-vis the upcoming caucus races. Could you just tell me how you think some of that's going to play out, for instance, with perhaps the conference chair race in the Democratic Party, or the future speaker's race in the Republican Party?
Anyone?
Well, I think there's clearly stability in the Democratic ranks. If we took back control, there would obviously be a very vigorous race for whip, and a number of people who have yet to even float their candidacies would be probably in that race. People like Nancy Pelosi, John Lewis, Steny Hoyer. But there would be a very vigorous race for caucus chair between Rosa DeLauro and Martin Frost. And there are three people, Albert Wynn, Cal Dooley, some very strong people running for vice chair on our side. And I really think that that's kind of inside politics for people. But I mentioned earlier, Republicans were already having an argument over who should succeed Newt Gingrich between Bob Livingston and the majority leader, Dick Armey. And I think, by the way, that probably had more to do with some of the turmoil at the end of this session than anything we may be talking about in the minority.
I think that's very true. Yes,
Well,
sir.
I'll
Oops,
just
Nick?
add on,
Yeah.
on the Republican side, it's not a matter of one wing or another. All of the people who are likely to succeed Newt are people who are very conservative. There's matters of personality. There are Tom DeLay succeeded in becoming whip as opposed to Bob Walker, who had been Newt's deputy and who might have been expected to become whip, because DeLay did a very good job of going out, raising money and campaigning for people around the country, so that when they came in, they identified with him as a friend. It had nothing to do with political, ideological differences, because there weren't any. So it's a matter of people going out and trying to say, I worked for you, you know me, I was in your district, you know, I'd appreciate your support. So it's not really, whatever fights there are over the direction of the party are not really being played out in the leadership races.
This gentleman, but we have, take a couple more, yes.
Good evening, Jerry Kelly, mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Question is, with the increase of third-party candidates, and the increase in unenrolled people. How does that play out in the Congress? Do you think it destabilizes the Congress? Just comments.
I mean, from a Republican standpoint, there's been very little impact on the congressional level. I mean, I think, third-party candidates get more of an emphasis on the national election scene, but primarily it really has not played into being a major factor. Right now, the supermajority of all races come down between the Republican candidate and the Democrat candidate. And once in a while, you'll have that third-party candidate, for example, in New York, where we have a right to life line that takes votes away if they're not the same candidate that is allowed to be on the Republican line or the conservative line. That's always been a part of the political factoring, though, and the way primaries are run in order to gauge your position on the line. So I don't really think that is necessarily anything new on a congressional level yet.
History has always been that the third-party candidate doesn't win. We only have Bernie Sanders won in the Congress, and he essentially is with the Democratic Party, so it's questionable whether there's a third party there or not. But he's a socialist in the modern world.
But the Democrats like to call him an independent sometimes.
Right.
We have
exactly.
one independent.
But what happens is usually when you see any kind of success like Susan's talking about, like the Green Party out in New Mexico, where they manage to shift the outcome, then one or the other parties will pretty quickly try to co-opt those voters. So it has impacts on elections, it has impacts on policy and direction people take, but almost never does the third party win. Now maybe we'll get proved wrong here before too long.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Pemble. I'm in the Graduate School of Education, also one of Professor Sharp's students. And I was wondering if each of you might address a particular concern I have, and that is the level of hostility and the degeneration of political discourse that we now seem to have in the country. And it's particularly depressing to me. I'm 26 years old, coming up to my political realizations, only recently, the past 8 or so years. And for most of my peer group, what we've seen as examples of public leadership and the kind of discussions and the kind of heated rhetoric that we see, I think is very disheartening for those people who aren't politically minded. And I particularly want to ask of those of you in the Republican Party, because how you can balance running against the institution. I see a very common theme in political candidates to bash the system of government itself, bash one another, bash the institution, and all it does is feed to the public's general, disinterest and thinking that the government's all messed up and everything's bad. And so my question to you is it that bad in your minds? Is this the worst thing you have all ever seen? And if it's not, please let me know. And do you think it's going to get better? Is there a trend that are we bottomed out? Are we going up? Is this going to get worse? What's your thinking on this?
How about a quick 1 minute from all?
I think that there's a couple of different parts of this answer. One of them is I think it's become less civil, certainly, than it was when I got there. Maybe it's because I left. I don't know, but
that contributed to it.
But one of the things I think that is significant is that we should not expect that the Congress is going to be a place where everybody sits down and calmly reaches consensus. I mean, that is where people with strongly different views, strongly held, fight out over, where the direction of the country ought to be, and that's Congress's job. The question is whether or not Vic and I can disagree and do it in a nice way, and we can say everybody who runs for Congress or for any office believes strongly in certain ideals, but whether or not you can accept incrementalism, moving a little bit at a time toward your goal. And I think that's been lost a little bit. But one thing, if I can take it back, I don't know if there's a starting point. But when Ronald Reagan was elected, prior to Ronald Reagan, there were kind of things like, well, let's make changes at the margins. Let's make little change. Okay, you want to spend $10 billion, we'll spend $9.5 billion. When Reagan came here, came to Washington, he had very different ideas that challenged the existing orthodoxy. Tip O'Neill, who was the speaker and the leading Democrat, had equally strong ideas about preserving what had happened up to that point, and the stakes went up. And the stakes are still high because the Democrats and Republicans have, for a long time it didn't matter because Republicans had no votes. you know, we had no strength. I mean, it was basically a one-party Congress. But now there is real competition between differing points of view. And I don't think we're going, I hope they'll get more civil and more deliberative, but I don't think we'll get to the point where everybody's going to sit down and you know, just kind of find agreement. I don't think that's going to happen.
Earlier in Susan's class, Alan Simpson said too many people think that their adversary should be their enemy. And we have too much of that, and I hope it's on the wane, actually, as people have gotten a little more acculturated to being in Congress, some that came with revolutionary zeal. But we also have spent increasingly large amounts of money destroying each other's image and reputation on television. Negative advertising works, and it also works to dilute public respect for the candidates and the institution they seem to want to serve in. We also have institutionalized the anti-Congress rhetoric. I'm very, very sensitive to this, having chaired the legislative branch committee for 16 years, fighting off people who use me as a foil, frankly, for an effort to destroy the Congress's reputation. And we were quite good at doing that on our own, by the way, with the House Bank and other problems that to some degree were blown out of proportion, but were a good political issue. That contributed to this public disdain, but I also think, frankly, and it's something you will not change, bringing television to the House and then ultimately to the Senate certainly has changed the House into a more soundbite, you know, hit them in the chops kind of environment rather than a truly deliberative or debating body. But remember, we haven't caned anyone in a couple of hundred, you know, no, it goes back to the Civil War.
It was the Senate, they did that.
Can I add one thing quickly? Because you know, it's also a function of what the leadership does. The quote term limits movement had a lot of fuel poured on it at a meeting of the Republican leadership when Newt Gingrich said, basically, we can't defeat the incumbents. Let's just find a way to get rid of the incumbents. And he came up with lines like there's more turnover in the Politburo than there is in the Congress, which of course is silly because during the 16 years I was there, 84% of the seats changed hands and most of them several times. So I mean, you know, the leadership actually drove this too.
But I think it just has to be said, though, that, you know, if that is your feeling, then you have a responsibility not to walk away, but to stay engaged. And I would submit that if anybody out there looks at Congress and sees flaws and says, then therefore it is just not a place that I want to, you know, in which I want to participate, well, then you go home and hang, and I don't mean you, but I mean, you know, then it is more your problem than it is ours, because that's how it gets that way. If you have a different vision of the way you want Congress to be, then more than 30% of the people should turn out to vote. Instead of just saying, oh, those negative ads disgusted me all. Well, all we're asking for is 5 minutes. We're not asking you to sign up and volunteer in the House of Representatives. You can make those changes. And the organized and the disgruntled and, you know, the bottom line to everything that characterizes every poll or every advertisement in the back of everybody's mind is that mad people vote. Well, if we can turn that around just a little bit, you will see a change, because Congress is just a reflection to a very large extent of what is out there in active America. And the more people who become active with a positive attitude, the more that change will be forced upon their representatives.
Just have time.
If I could just add one comment, I mean, to follow up on Susan's, you can act, and my suggestion is speak to your own about what you expect. Ask your party or your candidate you support to change his or her behavior or to tell them you don't like it. What tends to happen is we all say, well, my opponent's the one and everything. I would have friends come up to me and would actually, my supporters want to encourage me on in the negative. Now, I have responsibility for what I decide to do, but ironically, people's own supporters very often are the quickest to forgive and not ever call you to account. And they're precisely the people who can call you to account.
That's true.
So I would urge you as a citizen, speak up. You'll make a difference.
And we were saying, you don't make enemies, you make adversaries. That's the best way to legislate. It is a contact sport. Yes, final question, I think, have to do that. I'm getting a signal. Kathy is giving signals. Phil and I know what those are.
Yeah, as politicians, we want you to understand we're willing to talk to all of you.
We'll
Kathy's the one.
We'll talk on.
And all night.
Right.
My name is Elizabeth Humphrey.
We haven't
and
had a debate this year.
I'm a first-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School, and I wanted to take up this invitation to pick on the Democrats for a minute. Mr. Sharp alluded to the Green Party in the Southwest. I think we lost a couple of very strong Democratic seats when the Greens went in and took out environmental voters. Is the Democratic Party going to take advantage of its incredible credibility on the environmental issue, or is environmentalism something that's going to be left behind as Democrats move towards the middle?
That wasn't exactly what I had in mind in picking on the Democrats.
Talking about a softball.
Thanks for the help.
I don't honestly know the answer to that. The Democrats found environmentalism to be something of a paper tiger when the BTU vote, tax vote occurred, and discovered it was not the motivational proposition, partly on that vote and a few others. That doesn't mean there aren't many people in the Democratic Party that are fervently pro-environment. And indeed, I'm told the current Speaker of the House was actually looking for ways to demonstrate the environmentalism of the Republicans, because the credibility you talk about is so firm in the polls that who do you trust more on the environment? It's Democrats. What you're asking for is performance, of course, and doubting that it's there. I don't know what the answer is, but that Greens thing clearly will have an impact. And I suspect, is it one of the Udall people that's running for that seat now, who I suspect will be more environmentally sound than what was defeated. I didn't know the personalities now.
In fact, Udall has already picked up support from some of the Greens who opposed the prior Democratic nominee, and so some of it's coming back to normal. But in the West, as you know, and your part of the country and mine, we have divisions in the ranks in both parties on the environment, and if you aren't careful, you might pick up support from the Greens and lose the majority because they're not sympathetic with all of the environmental agenda. So it's a very, very thin blade upon which to walk in New Mexico or Northern California or Eastern Oregon, not so necessarily in downtown, in Portland.
Very true. Well, I thank you very much thank the panel and the audience for a lively and informative session. Vic, thank you for being in a full day in Susan's study group.
Yeah, we put him to work today, ladies
the
and gentlemen.
IOP supper, and then here at the ARCO Forum, and we wish you well. And we can all tell you, jump in and get wet all over. You'll love it.
Life is okay
Life
after
is, life is okay. Come on in. And you can be just as effective as you have been in Congress on the outside. And you will, because that's the way you've always done it. And I think all of us feel that we are effective being on outside of the Congress, whatever our roles were at that time.
Yeah, now we send these people out to do the battles.
Yep, and that area of civility, just one thought on that. I always, the people who say don't get mad, get even, also get ulcers, gas, and heartburn. And don't forget, hatred corrodes the container it's carried in.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki. Good to see you, Rick.
Good luck. Rick, thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
What fun. Bill, thank you.
Absolutely, Alan. Enjoyed it.
Fun.
Oh, Vic, thank you so much.
Are we going to stay for our little discussion? Hang out. I don't know. No problem. What were you going to ask?